The unseen hand. Marcus Fletcher adjusted the straps on his faded janitor's uniform, the cotton fabric clinging uncomfortably under the weight of his cleaning supplies. The quiet hum of the early morning filled the sleek, metallic hallways of Fletcher Enterprises, a global conglomerate known for its innovation, high profits, and Marcus's own relentless pursuit of excellence. Despite the prestige his name carried, few within these walls would recognize him. And that was exactly how Marcus intended it to be. For months, he had roamed the offices in disguise, taking on the role of a janitor. To many, it seemed an absurd choice for one of the world's most influential CEOs. But Marcus believed that true leadership wasn't about commanding from ivory towers. It was about understanding people at their most unguarded moments. He wanted to see how his employees treated each other, especially those deemed invisible. As he pushed his cart into the elevator, Marcus thought back to the board meeting 6 months ago. Anonymous complaints had surfaced about a growing toxic culture. Some employees claimed they felt undervalued, while others alleged outright bullying. Marcus had dismissed the complaints at first, chalking them up to isolated incidents. But when the company's turnover rate started spiking, he realized he needed to see the truth for himself. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 14th floor. Marcus stepped out into the operations hub, where employees bustled about, clutching coffee cups and murmuring pleasantries. None of them spared a glance at the man in the navy blue uniform. Marcus smiled faintly. His anonymity was his greatest asset. The day began, as it often did, with Marcus cleaning windows near the conference rooms while listening to the chatter around him. His focus today was on Brent Howard, the senior operations manager. Brent's name had come up repeatedly in complaints. On paper, he was a high achiever, a man who delivered results. But beneath the surface, whispers painted him as a bully who manipulated his team to maintain his image. Marcus's observations didn't take long to confirm those rumors. As he polished the glass walls, he overheard Brent berating an intern, a young man nervously clutching a stack of binders. "I don't care if you were up all night working on it," Brent snapped. "If this presentation doesn't impress the investors, you're done. Do you hear me? Done." The intern stammered an apology, his face pale. Brent dismissed him with a wave, turning to bark orders at another employee. Marcus's grip tightened on his cloth. It wasn't the first time he'd witnessed Brent's abrasive behavior, but each instance stung anew. By mid-morning, Marcus found himself in the break room, fixing a squeaky coffee machine while employees gathered around. The space was a crossroads of gossip and grievances, a place where workers felt safe enough to vent. "I swear, Brent's getting worse," said a woman in a sharp blazer, her voice low but indignant. "Yesterday, he rewrote my report and presented it as his own." "Classic Brent," another replied. "And if you try to call him out, he'll make your life hell. Look what happened to Karen in marketing." Marcus kept his head down, pretending to tinker with the machine. The stories mirrored the complaints he'd read, tales of humiliation, credit theft, and intimidation. What angered him most wasn't just Brent's behavior, but the culture that allowed it to persist. People were afraid to speak up, and HR seemed powerless to intervene. As the group dispersed, Marcus felt a pang of guilt. He had built this company to champion innovation and integrity, yet here it was, reduced to whispers of fear and resentment. He realized that if he didn't act soon, everything he'd worked for could crumble. In the afternoon, Marcus positioned himself near the tech support department, a quieter corner of the office where employees often worked late into the night. He approached Raj Patel, a young software engineer hunched over his desk. "Morning," Marcus said, emptying a trash bin. "How's it going?" Raj looked up, startled. Most people didn't bother talking to the janitorial staff. "Oh, you know, the usual, putting out fires." "Sounds stressful," Marcus replied. "What kind of fires?" Raj sighed, leaning back. "Brent, mostly. He insisted we delay a system upgrade. And now the servers are crashing left and right. Of course, he's blaming us." Marcus frowned. "And HR? Have they stepped in?" Raj gave a bitter laugh. HR, please. Brent's untouchable. As long as the numbers look good, no one cares. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, filing away Raj's words. It was the same story he'd heard time and time again. Brent's ability to manipulate the system wasn't just an individual failing. It was symptomatic of a deeper rot within the company's culture. That evening, Marcus sat alone in his modest apartment, reviewing his notes. The day's observations had been particularly troubling. Brent's bullying wasn't just a problem. It was a symptom of a company-wide issue. Somewhere along the way, Fletcher Enterprises had lost sight of its core values. The pursuit of profit had overshadowed empathy, collaboration, and respect. Marcus knew that fixing the culture would take more than just firing Brent. It would require systemic changes, starting from the top. But first, he needed more information, more allies. And so, he resolved to continue his undercover mission, knowing that each passing day brought him closer to a reckoning. As he closed his notebook, Marcus made a silent vow. He would reclaim the soul of his company, not as a distant figurehead, but as a leader willing to get his hands dirty. For now, the janitor would keep cleaning, but soon the CEO would rise to act. Shadows of a broken system. The morning sun barely touched the edges of the towering Fletcher Enterprises building when Marcus Fletcher stepped through its revolving doors. His reflection in the gleaming glass facade reminded him of the dual roles he now lived: the billionaire CEO who built an empire, and the anonymous janitor tasked with exposing the cracks within it. He glanced down at the name stitched onto his uniform: James. It wasn't just a pseudonym. It was a shield that allowed him to see the truth, raw and unfiltered. Today felt different. There was an unease in the air, a tension that Marcus hadn't noticed before. The usual murmur of morning greetings seemed forced, and employees moved with their heads down, avoiding eye contact. Something had shifted overnight. As he pushed his cleaning cart into the operations hub, Marcus noticed Sarah from marketing hurriedly gathering her things at her desk. Her face was pale, her movements jittery. She looked over her shoulder, as though expecting someone to reprimand her. "Sarah, what's going on?" one of her coworkers whispered. "Brent," she replied, her voice trembling. He called me into his office first thing this morning. Told me my campaign numbers weren't good enough and said I'm on probation. Probation. But your campaign did well. The coworker protested. It's been our best performing one this quarter. Sarah shook her head, biting her lip. It doesn't matter. He said I lacked initiative and that my attitude is holding the team back. Marcus clenched his jaw as he pretended to mop a nearby floor. He had heard enough. Brent wasn't just intimidating his employees. He was systematically eroding their confidence. Probation over a successful campaign. It was manipulation at its worst. Targeted, deliberate, and cruel. Later in the morning, Marcus found himself in the break room once again. Brent Howard entered, his presence like a storm cloud. Conversations died instantly, and the room fell silent as he made his way to the coffee machine. He jabbed at the buttons with unnecessary force, muttering under his breath. Can't this company afford better machines, or better janitors to fix them? Brent sneered, glancing at Marcus. I'll take a look, sir, Marcus replied evenly, stepping forward. Don't bother, Brent snapped. You'll probably make it worse. The room remained silent as Marcus examined the machine, despite knowing it worked perfectly. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, using the moment to observe the fear etched into the employees' faces. They averted their eyes, avoiding any chance of catching Brent's attention. It wasn't just fear of reprimand. It was the kind of dread that came from prolonged exposure to unchecked power. By mid-afternoon, Marcus decided to dig deeper into the tech department. He found Raj Patel staring blankly at his screen, the glow from his monitor reflecting exhaustion in his eyes. Rough day? Marcus asked, placing an empty trash bin back under Raj's desk. You could say that, Raj replied, not looking up. Brent's been riding us nonstop. Every time something goes wrong, It's our fault, even when he's the one delaying critical updates. Have you reported it to HR? Marcus asked, even though he already knew the answer. Raj let out a dry laugh. You think HR is going to stand up to Brent? As long as the company looks good on paper, they don't care how bad it is on the ground. The bitterness in Raj's voice struck a chord. Marcus had built this company on the ideals of innovation, respect, and collaboration. Yet here was an employee who had lost all faith in those very values. That evening, Marcus visited the HR department under the pretense of cleaning their office space. He noticed Lydia, the head of HR, seated at her desk, her head resting in her hands. She looked up as Marcus emptied her trash can, offering a tired smile. Long day, Marcus asked casually. Lydia sighed. It always is, especially when it comes to certain managers. Marcus paused. Brent. Lydia looked at him, surprised by his knowledge. Yes, Brent. He's difficult. Why hasn't anything been done about him? Marcus asked, keeping his tone neutral. Lydia hesitated, her eyes scanning the room as though to ensure no one was listening. It's not that simple. Brent delivers results, and the board only sees numbers. If I push too hard, I'll end up on the chopping block instead of him. Her candor confirmed Marcus's suspicions. Brent wasn't thriving because of his own competence, but because the system allowed it. The board's obsession with metrics over morale had created a fertile ground for managers like Brent to rise unchecked. What if the board saw the human cost of those numbers? Marcus asked carefully. Lydia frowned, her gaze sharpening. What do you mean? Marcus shrugged. Just that sometimes numbers don't tell the whole story. If the board could see what's really happening, maybe they'd think differently. Lydia studied him for a moment, as though sensing there was more to him than met the eye. That's a nice thought, she said finally. But it would take more than a janitor to make that happen. The next day, Marcus began laying the groundwork for his plan. He started with small conversations, quietly building connections with employees across departments. He listened to their grievances, validated their frustrations, and subtly encouraged them to believe in the possibility of change. In the break room, he approached Sarah, who was staring blankly at her coffee cup. Rough week? Marcus asked. She looked up, startled. You could say that. It feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough. Do you believe that? Marcus asked gently. Sarah hesitated. I don't know. I think Brent wants us to feel that way. It's how he keeps control. Marcus nodded. What if that changed? What if someone stood up to him? Sarah let out a bitter laugh. I don't think anyone has the power to stand up to Brent. Not in this company. Marcus smiled faintly. Sometimes change starts with just one person willing to try. That afternoon, Marcus positioned himself near the conference rooms where Brent was holding a meeting. Through the glass walls, he watched as Brent berated his team for what he called subpar performance, even though the numbers on the presentation slides told a different story. Employees sat in silence, their expressions a mix of humiliation and resignation. Marcus's fists clenched as he fought the urge to intervene. He knew it wasn't time. Not yet. But soon. As Brent's voice echoed through the hallway, Marcus silently resolved that this would be one of the last times anyone in Fletcher Enterprises had to endure such treatment. The tide was turning, and Marcus was determined to lead it. That night, Marcus returned to his apartment and opened his notebook. He reviewed the week's observations, organizing them into a plan. It wouldn't be enough to simply remove Brent. The entire system needed to be rebuilt. That meant addressing not just toxic individuals, but the structures that enable them. For the first time in months, Marcus felt hope. Change was coming, and it was going to start with him. Not as a janitor, but as the CEO who had seen the truth and was ready to act. The gathering storm. The sun cast long shadows across the Fletcher Enterprises building as Marcus Fletcher walked through the revolving doors. Today, the gleaming towers seemed more imposing than ever, their reflective surfaces mirroring the mounting tension Marcus felt. It was time to take his covert mission to the next level. For weeks, he had observed the cracks in his company's foundation: bullying, manipulation, and a culture of fear cultivated under managers like Brent Howard. But knowing wasn't enough. Action was inevitable. Marcus adjusted the brim of his janitor's cap and pushed his cleaning cart toward the elevators. The wheels squeaked slightly as he entered the crowded lift, blending into the sea of distracted employees. Their silence was palpable, broken only by the occasional murmur of hurried conversations about deadlines and projects. The journey to the 14th floor felt slower than usual, giving Marcus time to reflect on his strategy. His quiet conversations with employees had unearthed not just grievances, but a glimmer of hope. Many had expressed frustration, yes, but also a cautious desire for change. It was this flicker of possibility that Marcus planned to nurture into a blaze. As the elevator doors opened, the usual flurry of activity greeted Marcus. Employees moved briskly, clutching coffee cups and laptops, their faces set with grim determination. Yet something felt off. An undercurrent of unease hung in the air. Marcus didn't have to wait long to find its source. Brent Howard's voice boomed from the far end of the operations floor, cutting through the office, dim like a whip. "Is this what you call professional work?" Brent barked at a young woman whose face was flushed with embarrassment. "I could get better results from a first-year intern. Fix it, or don't bother coming back on Monday." The woman nodded quickly, her trembling hands clutching a folder as she scurried back to her desk. Brent muttered something under his breath, loud enough for those nearby to hear, and stalked away toward the break room. Marcus watched him go, his jaw tightening. Brent's reign of terror had gone unchecked for too long. Marcus followed Brent discreetly into the break room, where a small group of employees stood in uneasy silence, avoiding eye contact with their manager. Brent poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements sharp and impatient. "This machine is still broken," he snapped, slamming the pot back onto its base. "Do any of you even notice these things, or is it only my job to keep this place running?" The employees exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. Marcus, who had entered with his mop in hand, stepped forward. "I'll take a look at it, sir," he said calmly. Brent turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "You again. Just fix it, and try not to break anything this time." Marcus suppressed the urge to respond and began inspecting the machine. He knew it worked perfectly well. Brent's outburst had nothing to do with the coffee. It was about dominance, about reminding everyone in the room who held the power. But today, Marcus wasn't just observing. He was laying the groundwork for something bigger. By midday, Marcus had set his sights on the tech department, where he found Raj Patel hunched over his desk, his fingers flying across the keyboard. The lines of exhaustion on Raj's face told a story that Marcus had seen repeated throughout the office. He approached with his usual cleaning supplies, careful not to draw too much attention. "Morning, Raj," Marcus said, setting his mop against the wall. "How's it going?" Raj glanced up, surprised to see the janitor. "Oh, just trying to keep the servers from crashing again. Brent's been breathing down our necks all morning." "Sounds like a tough day," Marcus replied, his tone sympathetic. "Anything I can do to help?" Raj chuckled bitterly. "Unless you can get Brent off our backs, I think we're stuck." "What if someone did?" Marcus asked, his voice casual but pointed. Raj looked at him more closely, curiosity flickering in his tired eyes. "What do you mean?" Marcus shrugged. "Just that sometimes change starts with one person willing to push back." Raj's gaze lingered for a moment before he nodded faintly. "Yeah, well, it would take more than one person to fix things around here." Marcus smiled faintly, filing away Raj's words. He wasn't wrong, but the first push was all Marcus needed to start the chain reaction. That afternoon, Marcus took his observations to the next level. He discreetly slipped a small recording device into his pocket, determined to document Brent's behavior firsthand. The decision wasn't made lightly. Marcus understood the risks involved. But he also knew that employees like Sarah, Raj, and countless others deserved more than empty promises. They needed action. It didn't take long for the device to capture its first incriminating moment. Brent was holding a team meeting in one of the glass-walled conference rooms, his voice loud enough to carry into the hallway where Marcus pretended to clean. "This is unacceptable," Brent thundered, slamming his hand on the table. "I don't care what excuses you have. If these numbers don't improve, heads will roll." A young analyst tried to interject, her voice trembling. "Mr. Howard, the client requested last-minute changes. We did our best to." "Did I ask for your opinion?" Brent cut her off. "Do your job or find another one." Marcus's grip tightened on his mop handle as he recorded every word. Brent's tirade continued, filled with insults and thinly veiled threats. It was a masterclass in intimidation, and Marcus knew it would be invaluable evidence. As the day wound down, Marcus retreated to the janitor's closet to review the recordings. Listening to Brent's voice was infuriating, but it also solidified Marcus's resolve. This wasn't just about one toxic manager. It was about dismantling the system that allowed him to thrive. That evening, Marcus made a call to Lydia, the head of HR. They had spoken briefly before, but now Marcus was ready to pull her into his plan. "Lydia, it's James," he began, using his janitor persona. "I've been looking into the complaints about Brent." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "James, I appreciate your concern, but—" "I have proof," Marcus interrupted. "Recordings of how he treats his team. If the board heard them, they wouldn't be able to ignore this." Another pause. Then Lydia's voice softened. "Proof changes things. Bring it to me, and we'll figure out the next steps." Marcus nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I'll be in touch soon." As he hung up, Marcus felt a surge of determination. The pieces were falling into place, and the storm he had been quietly gathering was about to break. For now, he was still James the janitor. But soon, he would step forward as Marcus Fletcher, the CEO ready to reclaim his company. The battle for Fletcher Enterprises had begun. Breaking the silence. The dawn of a new week brought a quiet determination to Marcus Fletcher. For weeks, he had moved as an unseen observer through the hallways of Fletcher Enterprises, gathering whispers and truths about the toxic culture that had festered under his watch. But today was different. Today, Marcus was no longer just a janitor. He was a man on the verge of reshaping his company from the ground up. The evidence he had collected against Brent Howard was damning. Audio recordings, first-hand testimonies, and his own observations painted a vivid picture of a workplace ruled by fear and manipulation. But Marcus knew that simply exposing Brent wasn't enough. The culture that allowed such behavior to thrive needed to be dismantled entirely. The first step in his plan was to build alliances, starting with Lydia, the head of HR. Her cautious willingness to address the issue had given Marcus the confidence to involve her. He had arranged a meeting under the guise of a casual discussion. After all, James the janitor couldn't exactly schedule official appointments. Marcus arrived early at Lydia's office, his janitor's cart parked discreetly outside the door. Inside, Lydia sat behind her desk, her face etched with the weariness of someone carrying more burdens than she should. "Morning, James," Lydia said, looking up. "What brings you by so early?" Marcus closed the door behind him, glancing around to ensure privacy. Then he reached into his pocket and produced a small USB drive. "This," he said simply, placing it on her desk. Lydia frowned, picking up the drive. "What's this?" "Proof," Marcus replied, his voice low but firm. "Proof of what Brent's been doing. It's not just hearsay. It's recordings of his meetings, his conversations, his threats." Lydia's eyes widened as she stared at the device. "You recorded him?" Marcus nodded. "And not just him. Employees are scared, Lydia. They're scared to speak up because they think no one will listen. But you and I both know the truth. It's not just about Brent. It's about the system that protects him." Lydia leaned back in her chair, the weight of the moment sinking in. If I take this to the board, it'll be a fight, she said. Brent delivers results. They won't want to hear that those results come at the expense of their employees. Then we make them hear, Marcus said, his tone resolute. This isn't just about Brent. It's about the kind of company Fletcher Enterprises wants to be. And if they can't see that, then maybe they're the problem too. For a long moment, Lydia said nothing, her gaze fixed on the USB drive. Then she nodded. All right. I'll review this tonight. But if we're going to do this, we need to be strategic. The board won't act unless the evidence is overwhelming. Marcus nodded. You'll have it. And I'll be there to back you up when the time comes. The next phase of Marcus's plan was to rally the employees. He couldn't directly approach them as the CEO just yet. His disguise as James was still critical to gathering unfiltered perspectives. But he could empower them to find their voices. During his rounds, Marcus began striking up conversations with employees, listening to their frustrations and offering subtle encouragement. In the break room, he found Sarah sitting alone, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Her usual bright demeanor had dimmed after weeks of relentless pressure from Brent. Morning, Marcus said, taking the seat across from her. Rough day. Sarah looked up, startled, but then offered a faint smile. Rough week, more like. Want to talk about it? Marcus asked, his tone gentle. She hesitated, then sighed. It's Brent. It's always Brent. He put me on probation for no reason, and now I feel like I'm walking on eggshells every second of the day. Marcus nodded. You're not alone, you know. A lot of people feel the same way. Sarah's eyes widened. They do. Absolutely, Marcus said. And the only way things will change is if people like you speak up. You're stronger than you think, Sarah. Her expression shifted, a flicker of hope breaking through the despair. Do you really think it'll make a difference? I know it will, Marcus said. Sometimes change starts with just one voice. By midday, Marcus had spoken with Raj in tech, Karen in marketing, and even a few junior employees who rarely ventured outside their cubicles. Each conversation revealed the same pattern: fear, frustration, and a desperate longing for change. Marcus didn't just listen. He encouraged, planting the seeds of courage in each person he spoke to. The tipping point came in the late afternoon when Brent stormed into the operations hub, his face red with anger. He called an impromptu meeting, dragging employees from their desks and forcing them to gather in the central conference room. Marcus stood just outside, pretending to clean the glass walls as Brent began his tirade. This is unacceptable, Brent bellowed, slamming a stack of papers onto the table. Deadlines are being missed, clients are complaining, and the quality of work is pathetic. If this continues, heads will roll. A young analyst tried to speak up. Mr. Howard, the client requested changes at the last minute. Excuses. Brent cut her off. I don't want excuses. I want results. Marcus watched as the analyst's face fell, her confidence shattered. Around the table, employees exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. It was a scene Marcus had witnessed countless times, a display of power meant to intimidate and silence. But not today. Enough, Marcus said, his voice firm. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. Brent's eyes narrowed in disbelief. What did you just say? Brent demanded, his tone dripping with disdain. I said enough, Marcus repeated, stepping into the room. This isn't leadership, Brent. This is bullying. Brent sneered. And who do you think you are? A janitor. Stay in your lane. Marcus took a step closer, his gaze locked on Brent's. You're right. I am a janitor. But that doesn't mean I can't see what's wrong here. You've built your career on tearing people down, and I won't stand by and let it continue. The employees around the table stared, their shock slowly giving way to something else. Hope. Marcus felt it like a spark, growing stronger with every word. Brent's face turned red as he sputtered. You have no idea what you're talking about. This is how business works. No, Brent, Marcus said, his voice steady. This is how toxic cultures thrive. And it ends now. That evening, Marcus returned to his apartment, exhausted but exhilarated. The cracks in Brent's armor were finally beginning to show, and the employees had seen a glimpse of what change could look like. The storm was building, and soon it would sweep through Fletcher Enterprises, leaving no stone unturned. Marcus wasn't just ready. He was determined. The battle for his company's soul was far from over, but he knew one thing for certain. The silence had been broken, and there was no turning back. Unmasking the system, Marcus Fletcher entered the building of Fletcher Enterprises as the morning light barely grazed its towering structure. Today, his steps felt heavier, not from fatigue, but from the weight of the changes he was orchestrating. The cracks in the company's culture were now exposed, and the momentum of his covert mission was undeniable. Employees had begun to whisper about a janitor who wasn't afraid to speak against Brent Howard's tyranny, a small ember of rebellion against the toxic status quo. But Marcus knew that taking down Brent wasn't the endgame. Toxic leaders like Brent didn't thrive in isolation. They thrived because the systems around them enabled their behavior. This was no longer just about one man. It was about dismantling the very framework that had allowed fear and manipulation to take root. Today, Marcus wasn't just confronting Brent. He was going to confront the system. As Marcus pushed his cleaning cart into the bustling operations hub, he noticed the difference immediately. Conversations that used to be whispers now carried a hint of boldness. Employees exchanged knowing glances and hushed encouragements, emboldened by the janitor who dared to challenge authority. Sarah, the young marketing associate, caught his eye as he passed. She gave him a small, grateful smile, a silent acknowledgement of his courage the day before. Marcus nodded back, his resolve hardening. This was why he had begun this journey. For people like Sarah, who deserved a workplace that valued their contributions instead of crushing their spirits. In the early afternoon, Marcus stationed himself outside the conference rooms. Brent Howard was holding another team meeting, his booming voice echoing through the glass walls. Marcus didn't bother pretending to clean this time. He leaned against his cart and listened, openly observing the scene. "I don't want excuses," Brent barked, pacing the room. "I want results. If you can't deliver, I'll find someone who can." The employees sat stiffly around the table, their faces a mixture of fear and resentment. But this time, something was different. There were glimmers of defiance in their eyes, subtle but unmistakable. Marcus had seen it before, the moment when people realize they didn't have to accept mistreatment as the norm. As the meeting adjourned, Brent stormed out, barely glancing at Marcus as he passed. The employees filtered out more slowly, their whispers carrying hints of frustration and cautious hope. Marcus stepped forward and addressed the group quietly. "You don't have to put up with this," he said, his voice low but firm. "Change is possible, but it starts with all of you." One of the analysts, a young man named Ethan, hesitated. "How? HR doesn't do anything, and Brent's too powerful." Marcus smiled faintly. "He's only as powerful as the silence around him. The more you speak out, the less control he has." The group exchanged uncertain glances, but Marcus could see the seed of courage taking root. By mid-afternoon, Marcus found himself in the HR department, meeting Lydia for what would be the most pivotal discussion yet. She was already waiting for him, the USB drive he had given her sitting on the desk between them. "I listened to the recordings," Lydia began, her voice steady but serious. "It's worse than I thought. Brent isn't just difficult. He's dangerous. But you're right, this isn't just about him. It's about the culture that's allowed him to thrive." Marcus nodded. "If we want to fix this, we need more than evidence. We need a plan. Employees need to feel safe speaking out, and leadership needs to be held accountable." Lydia leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "I've been thinking about that. What if we organize an anonymous forum? Employees can share their experiences without fear of retaliation. It would give us a clearer picture of the issues across the company, not just with Brent. That's a start, Marcus agreed. But we also need to make it clear that leadership is committed to change. If the board doesn't take this seriously, nothing will stick. Lydia hesitated. And what about Brent? Marcus's expression hardened. He won't be a problem much longer. Trust me. The tipping point came later that afternoon, when Marcus decided it was time to confront Brent directly. He found the senior manager in his office, looming over an assistant who looked on the verge of tears. Marcus entered without knocking, his presence startling both of them. "What do you want?" Brent demanded, glaring at him. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at the assistant and said gently, "You should go. I'll take it from here." The assistant fled, leaving Marcus and Brent alone. Brent crossed his arms, his expression a mix of annoyance and disbelief. "You're overstepping your bounds, janitor. Get out before I call security." Marcus stepped closer, his calm demeanor unnerving Brent. "Do you know what your biggest mistake is, Brent?" he asked. "It's not your bullying or your manipulation. It's underestimating the people you think are beneath you." Brent scoffed. "Save the lecture. You're just a glorified janitor." Marcus smiled faintly and reached into his pocket. He pulled out his ID badge, flipping it over to reveal his name and title. Marcus Fletcher, CEO. Brent's face drained of color. What? This is some kind of joke." "No joke," Marcus said, his voice cold. "I spent the past few months watching you tear people down, take credit for their work, and create a culture of fear. That ends today." Brent sputtered, struggling to find his footing. This isn't how things are done. I've delivered results." "At what cost?" Marcus shot back. "Employee morale is in the gutter, turnover rates are through the roof, and the only thing you've delivered is misery." Brent's bravado crumbled as Marcus leaned closer. "You're done here, Brent. Effective immediately. HR will handle the details, but I suggest you start packing." By evening, the news of Brent's dismissal had spread like wildfire. Employees gathered in small clusters, their whispers carrying a mix of shock and relief. Marcus didn't make a grand announcement. His actions spoke louder than words. He knew this was only the beginning. Removing Brent was a step forward, but the real work, rebuilding the company's culture, was just beginning. That night, Marcus met with Lydia and the senior leadership team. They laid out a plan to address the systemic issues that had allowed toxic behaviors to thrive. Anonymous forums, leadership training, and a renewed focus on employee well-being would form the foundation of the new Fletcher Enterprises. As Marcus left the office, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in months, the towering building didn't seem so imposing. The storm he had started was now a force for change, and he was ready to lead his company into a brighter future. The new foundation. The day after Brent Howard's dismissal, the atmosphere at Fletcher Enterprises was unlike anything Marcus Fletcher had ever seen. The usual tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud had been replaced by a cautious, almost hesitant sense of relief. Employees moved with less urgency but with more purpose, their shoulders a little straighter, their voices a little louder. For the first time in months, it felt as though hope had entered the building. Marcus arrived early, dressed not as a janitor but in his usual tailored suit. The contrast was striking. The quiet observer had become the commanding leader once again. Today, he wasn't just here to clean up the mess. He was here to rebuild from the ground up. Fletcher Enterprises wasn't just a company to him. It was his vision, his legacy, and it was time to reclaim it. Morning meeting. The turning point. By mid-morning, Marcus had called an all-hands meeting in the main auditorium. Every seat was filled, and employees lined the walls, whispering nervously. The murmurs grew louder when Marcus walked onto the stage, his presence commanding attention. For most of them, it was the first time they had seen him in person. Marcus approached the microphone, pausing to let the room settle into silence. He looked out over the crowd, meeting their eyes one by one. This wasn't a moment for rehearsed speeches or empty platitudes. It was a moment for truth. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm but resolute. "I want to start by saying two words that I should have said long ago. I'm sorry." The room was so quiet that Marcus could hear the hum of the air conditioning. He took a breath before continuing. "For months, I've been hearing whispers about the culture in this company, about fear, mistreatment, and a lack of accountability. At first, I thought it couldn't be true. Fletcher Enterprises was built on the values of integrity, respect, and collaboration. How could we have strayed so far?" Marcus's gaze swept the room, his tone softening. "But the truth is, we did stray. And as your leader, I take full responsibility. I was too distant, too focused on numbers and outcomes to see what was happening right under my nose. That changes today." The employees exchanged uncertain glances, but Marcus pressed on. "Yesterday, we took a step forward. Brent Howard is no longer with this company. His behavior was unacceptable, and we will not tolerate the kind of toxicity here." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, some surprised, others relieved. Marcus let it settle before continuing. "But removing one person isn't enough," he said. "The problem isn't just about Brent. It's about the culture that allowed him to thrive. That's on me. And it's on all of us to fix it." The plan for change. Marcus spent the next 20 minutes outlining his vision for a new Fletcher Enterprises. It wasn't just about policies or procedures. It was about rebuilding trust and fostering a culture where every employee felt valued. Anonymous employee forums. Marcus announced the immediate launch of Voices of Fletcher, a series of anonymous forums where employees could share their experiences and ideas without fear of retaliation. The forums would be moderated by a neutral third party to ensure transparency. Leadership training. All managers and team leaders would undergo mandatory training focused on emotional intelligence, conflict resolution, and ethical leadership. "Leadership isn't about authority," Marcus said. "It's about service." Employee wellness initiatives. Marcus introduced a new wellness program that included mental health resources, flexible work options, and team-building activities designed to break down hierarchical barriers. Accountability measures. He promised to establish an internal oversight committee tasked with monitoring workplace culture and addressing issues before they could escalate. As of today, Marcus concluded, Fletcher Enterprises is recommitting itself to the values it was built on. And this time, we're not just saying it, we're living it. The ripple effect. As the meeting ended, the employees filed out in a stunned silence, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. But something else lingered in the air, a spark of optimism, a sense that change wasn't just possible but inevitable. Throughout the day, Marcus walked the floors, engaging with employees directly. He didn't stay confined to his executive office. Instead, he immersed himself in the daily rhythms of the company. He visited the tech department, where Raj Patel was troubleshooting the server issue. "Raj," Marcus said, extending a hand, "I just wanted to say thank you for your hard work and for your honesty. It's employees like you who inspire me to be better." Raj blinked in surprise before shaking his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. It means a lot." In the marketing department, Marcus found Sarah sitting at her desk, her probation lifted and her confidence slowly returning. "Sarah," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder, "I'm proud of you for standing tall. Your campaign numbers are incredible, and I can't wait to see what you do next." Sarah's eyes glistened as she smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. I won't let you down." Confronting the board. Later that evening, Marcus held a private meeting with the company's board of directors. They were an intimidating group of seasoned executives, their focus laser-sharp on profits and metrics. But Marcus wasn't here to back down. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I know some of you may be concerned about the changes I've implemented. You're worried about the bottom line, and I understand that. But let me be clear, a toxic culture costs more than we can measure." He presented a detailed report outlining the financial toll of high turnover rates, low morale, and employee burnout. Then he shared the testimonies and recordings he had gathered during his undercover mission. "This isn't just about money," Marcus said, his voice steady. "It's about doing what's right." Fletcher Enterprises was never meant to be a machine that grinds people down for the sake of profits. It was meant to be a place where people thrive, where innovation and integrity go hand in hand. By the end of the meeting, the board was visibly shaken. One by one, they nodded their approval for Marcus's plan, though their expressions ranged from grudging acceptance to genuine support. The road ahead. The weeks that followed were transformative. The anonymous forums became a powerful platform for employees to share their stories, many of which highlighted systemic issues that went far beyond Brent Howard. The leadership training sessions were challenging but necessary, forcing managers to confront their own biases and behaviors. Employees began to see the changes take shape. Sarah's probation was reversed, and she was promoted to a senior marketing role. Raj's team received the resources they needed to tackle long-overdue projects. Lydia, once hesitant to act, became a vocal advocate for employee rights. And Marcus? He remained on the ground floor, working side by side with his employees, not as a distant figurehead, but as a leader who had earned their trust. A legacy restored. Months later, Fletcher Enterprises was almost unrecognizable. The office buzzed with collaboration and creativity. The fear and resentment that once plagued its halls replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Marcus stood by the window of his executive office, looking out over the city skyline. He thought back to his first day as James the janitor, the skepticism he had felt about his unconventional plan. But now, as he watched his employees thrive, he knew it had been worth it. The knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Sarah, holding a binder filled with ideas for a new campaign. Behind her stood Raj and a handful of other employees, their faces lit with excitement. "Mr. Fletcher," Sarah said, smiling, "we wanted to show you something." Marcus gestured for them to come in, his heart swelling with pride. This was the company he had always envisioned, a place where every voice mattered, where innovation and integrity thrived hand in hand. For the first time in years, Marcus felt at peace. Fletcher Enterprises was more than a business, it was a family. And together, they were unstoppable.